Continuing to read out of ABA's staff analysis on the definitions of private company and public business entity. And the reason why is if you're a public business entity, you have to fill out like a long call report. If you're a private business entity, you can be exempt from it. So here's the U.S. Banking Agency guidance, starting on page 4. The call report instructions provide guidance clarifying how the FFIEC interprets the FASB definition. Regulators mainly focus on criterion E, whether privately held banks that have no debt securities outstanding will qualify as private. Criterion E has 2 conditions, of which the second condition is satisfied for those banks with greater than $500 million in assets. Per FDICA, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Improvement Act, banks with greater than $500 million in assets must file GAAP financial statements to the FDIC and make them available for public inspection. Call reports are not GAAP financial statements, and thus the filing of call reports is irrelevant. We note that call reports are not GAAP financial statements, nor is any portion of them considered to be GAAP financial statements, because they do not include all the GAAP required footnote disclosures. It is this reason that Criteria E parenthetically emphasizes that GAAP financial statements must include footnotes in order to satisfy the second condition of Criterion E. The call report instructions also note that many banks are subsidiaries of bank holding companies and that bank holding companies are not subject to FDICA. Therefore, bank holding companies, no matter the size, do not have the FDICA requirement to file GAAP financial statements for public inspection. Since banks are often wholly owned subsidiaries of bank holding companies, an implied restriction on the transfer of the bank shares exists. Therefore, the bank itself is not a PBE, as it does not satisfy the first condition of Criterion E. Since the shares are restricted and the bank holding company is not a PBE, as it does not satisfy the second condition of Criterion E, since it is not required to file GAAP financials for public inspection. ABA observations starting on page 5 with the requirement to file financial statements with a regulatory agency, then being followed by banks with non-SEC registered securities, being followed by S-Corps, True PS, which is trust preferred securities, brokered deposits, CDs issued by a bank, and then list discussing the periodic review, which is required. And there's 2 appendices before the report's finished. Looks like some flowcharts at the end. So inside of ABA observations, the requirement to file financial statements with a regulatory agency, many bankers are concerned that the requirement to file call reports essentially requires the bank by default to be a PBE and thus disqualifies it from the private company reporting privileges. For example, Criterion B states a company that is required by the SEC of 1934, as amended, to file furnished financial statements with a regulatory agency other than the SEC is a PBE. The call report instructions also parenthetically emphasize that a regulatory agency other than the SEC can be a banking agency. With this in mind, however, the combined 1933 and 1934 acts do not require banks that are regulated by the U.S. banking agencies to file financial statements with their regulatory agency unless they first qualify as an SEC registrant through those acts. Requirements to prepare and submit call reports, for example, generally come from the FDIC Act of 1933 as amended. Therefore, Criterion B is generally not applicable to non-SEC registered banks, though it can be applicable to certain bank subsidiaries. Part 2 of the ABA observations regarding banks with non-SEC registered securities. A company that has securities traded over the counter, including through brokers and agents that employ pink sheets or bulletin boards, is considered a PBE per Criterion D, which disqualifies an entity from the private company accounting privileges noted above. It is possible that many of these companies have historically considered themselves to be private for GAAP reporting purposes since they were not registered with the SEC. Some of these companies may also consider themselves private due to the relatively new SEC rules that increase the stakeholder threshold test for determining whether a company must register with the SEC. The key point here is that if a company has debt or equity traded through an outside broker, then it should review the markets in which its securities are traded to determine whether it would be considered a PBE and thus would not qualify for the private company alternatives for GAAP purposes. Banks that have issued debt, even those that are not mutual banks or are privately held, are at risk for being considered a PBE. In the past, many believe that such debt would not be considered to be publicly held. However, the debt markets have evolved over the past several years. For example, the FINRA Trace, which stands for Trade Reporting Compliance Engine, system records virtually every trade of a debt security that is performed by a broker. Until 2017, ABA staff and certain personnel from large auditing firms believe that, considered broadly, the mere entry into the FINRA Trace system would effectively mean that any bank with traded or transferred debt could qualify as a PBE. Based on subsequent discussions with the Depository Institutions Expert Panel of the AICPA and FASB staff members, the reference to over-the-counter market within Criterion D is meant to be interpreted narrowly and in context of a public market. Since FINRA Trace will record trades of securities within both private and public markets, it is important to use judgment to determine whether the related transfers occurred within a market that is considered public. Trades, listings, and quotes on an exchange, as noted in Criteria D, should be used as reference points when evaluating whether such a market is public. Therefore, the existence of a trade of its securities being recorded in FINRA Trace does not make a company a PBE by default. Bankers are advised, however, to use the FINRA Trace data, among other things, to help evaluate whether the market in which their securities are traded would be considered public. Within S corporations, in ABA's observations, some bankers have asked about why a subchapter S corp, sub S, in which stock ownership is, by its very nature, limited, could be considered a PBE. Sub S status is a tax election made for taxation purposes and not a status made for other legal or regulatory purposes. Therefore, the traditional sub S limitation on stockholders, currently at 100 shareholder households, might not be based on a documented contractual agreement between shareholders to restrict transfer of the company shares of stock. While it is common that sub S equity shares contain restrictions on their transfer in order to initially qualify for sub S status, such restrictions are not necessary and on an ongoing basis. We believe that contractual restrictions attached to a company's securities must have substance. However, such restrictions do not necessarily need to be physically attached to a company's to the securities themselves. They do not necessarily need to be defined on the physical stock or bond certificate. Supplemental agreements among all security holders and properly administered restrictions on transfers noted in the company bylaws can qualify as substantial restrictions within the spirit of the standard, resulting in allowing private entity treatment for those S corp banks that have no debt